What if I told you that being highly stressed won't actually kill you, but believing that stress is bad for you absolutely can?
Yeah, it's a completely wild concept, but the science absolutely backs it up.
Right. Today, we are completely dismantling everything you think you know about stress. I mean,
Mm.
we throw the word around constantly, right? Like for a traffic jam or, an overflowing inbox.
We treat it like this vague atmospheric nuisance that we just have to push through.
Exactly. But if you actually stop and look at what's happening inside your body when you feel overwhelmed, the reality is, well, it's far more complex. It's deeply physical and a lot more malleable than you might think.
It is a highly specific biological engine. When we look at the clinical realities, stress isn't just a mood. It's a physiological cascade that honestly has the power to alter your cells, reshape your brain, and dictate your long-term health.
And that is exactly our mission for you on today's Deep Dive. We've got this fascinating stack of sources that fundamentally redefine the mental and physical toll of stress.
We're moving way past the cliche of just, telling you to take a deep breath.
Right. We are going to uncover how chronic stress literally rewires the physical architecture of your mind, how it leaves a footprint on your DNA, and perhaps most shockingly, how your mere beliefs about stress can actually serve as a biological shield. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with where this whole concept even came from.
Yeah, the history is super interesting.
Because the word stress wasn't always a medical term, was it? I feel like I've heard it used more in, like, physics.
You'd be correct. The word originally comes from engineering.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was used to describe the physical load or pressure placed on a structural material, like the weight bearing down on a steel beam of a bridge, for example.
Well,
It actually didn't enter the biological lexicon until the 1930s, and that was all thanks to a young endocrinologist named Hans Selye.
right, right. I know Eli stumbled onto his big discovery kind of by accident, right? While doing some lab work with rats.
Yeah, it's one of those great accidental discoveries in science.
So how exactly did a botched experiment lead to our modern understanding of stress?
Well, Selye was working at McGill University, and he was trying to discover a new hormone. So he was injecting rats with ovarian extracts to see what physiological changes would occur.
Okay.
But, as a control group for his experiment, he also injected other rats with completely harmless saline solutions. Just basic scientific method.
So one group gets the active hormone, the other gets, like, salt water.
Correct. But when he examined the rats later, he noticed something bizarre. No matter what substance he had injected, the powerful hormone or the harmless salt water, every single rat showed the exact same triad of physical damage.
Wait, really? Both groups?
Both groups. They all had enlarged adrenal glands, shrunken thymus and lymph nodes, and bleeding stomach ulcers.
Wait, so the physical damage wasn't coming from the chemical he was injecting at all?
No, not at all. It was coming from the experience of being injected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he realized the rats were having this severe, nonspecific physical reaction simply to the trauma of being handled, being chased around the cage and, pricked with a needle.
That makes so much sense.
So from this, Selye borrowed that engineering term stress to describe this biological wear and tear.
Okay.
And he eventually developed a three-stage biological model called the general adaptation syndrome. First is the alarm phase, which is essentially the classic fight-or-flight response that Walter Cannon had conceptualized earlier.
Right. Adrenaline, heart pounding, all that.
Exactly. Then comes the resistance phase, where the body tries to adapt to the ongoing threat. And finally, exhaustion, where prolonged exposure depletes the body's resources and leads to systemic illness.
Well, that makes sense on a basic level, but it also treats human beings a bit too much like those steel bridge beams, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Like, it implies that stress is just an external weight pressing down on us, and if the weight is heavy enough, absolutely anyone will buckle. It feels like a very one-size-fits-all approach that ignores how totally different people react to the exact same situation.
And that was exactly the major criticism of Selye's early work.
Yeah.
He viewed stress as a purely biological reflex. It wasn't until decades later, in 1966 actually, that psychologists like Richard Lazarus completely flipped the script with his transactional model.
Right.
Lazarus argued that Selye was missing the most important variable in the entire equation, which is the human mind. Lazarus proposed that stress isn't located in the event itself.
Because the event is just an event.
Right. Stress happens during the appraisal of that event.
So by appraisal, you mean our subjective interpretation of what's happening.
Simply put, yeah. Stress occurs specifically when a person perceives that the demands of a situation exceed the resources they believe they have to cope with it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like, around that same time, Holmes and Rahe made this social readjustment rating scale to quantify life events, right? A spouse's death was 100, a vacation was a 13.
Even a vacation is a 13.
Yeah. Any change is a demand, but the exact same layoff notice or public speaking engagement can be completely catastrophic to one person and, barely register as a blip for another. It is purely based on their cognitive appraisal of their own ability to handle the fallout.
It makes me think of stress like carrying a heavy backpack.
Okay, yeah.
The old biological model assumed the physical damage to your back came purely from the objective weight of the bag. But this newer psychological model realizes the damage also depends on whether you've been doing squats at the gym and whether you actually believe you're strong enough to carry it.
I like that analogy.
But let me push back on this a little bit. If stress is all about our relationship to the event, does this mean we can just think our way out of a physiological reaction? Like, can a positive attitude literally stop a stomach ulcer?
What's fascinating here is that the mind and the body are not separate, isolated systems. The brain's subjective appraisal of a threat is exactly what pulls the trigger on the body's physical plumbing.
Right.
Cognitive appraisal isn't just a matter of having a good attitude or looking on the bright side. It is the literal on switch for a massive, very real chemical cascade in your bloodstream.
So if that psychological appraisal is the on switch, take us inside the body. What exactly happens in our internal plumbing when we make that split-second decision that, say, an overflowing inbox or a swerving car is a threat?
Well, the engine driving this entire process is something called the HPA axis.
The HPA axis.
Yeah, that stands for the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. Think of it like a military chain of command.
Okay.
Your brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, acts as the radar. When it flags a danger, it immediately sends a signal to the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus acts as the commanding officer, releasing a hormone that travels to the pituitary gland.
And the pituitary gland is sort of the dispatcher sending the signal out to the rest of the body.
Yes, exactly. It releases a messenger hormone called ACTH that travels all the way down through your bloodstream to your adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys.
Right.
And that final signal is what triggers the release of cortisol, our primary stress hormone.
And cortisol is an absolute powerhouse. I mean, when it floods your system alongside adrenaline, it completely takes over.
Oh, absolutely.
Your heart races, your pupils dilate, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, and blood flow is aggressively redirected away from your internal organs and out to your large muscle groups. Cortisol also mobilizes stored glucose into your bloodstream, so you have instant explosive energy.
Because it's preparing you for immediate physical action, to fight for your life or run away.
Right.
But to generate that kind of explosive energy, the HPA axis has to make sacrifices. It aggressively shuts down any bodily function that isn't essential for surviving the next 10 minutes.
That makes sense.
If you are running from a predator, you do not need to be digesting your lunch. You don't need your reproductive system functioning, and you certainly don't need your immune system expending energy scanning for cold viruses.
Which is brilliant if you're actually running from a tiger. That acute stress response is a total lifesaver. You get the burst of energy, you survive, the tiger leaves, and then your body goes back to baseline.
Yeah, the system actually has a built-in negative feedback loop. Once cortisol levels get high enough, they signal the brain to shut off the alarm. In short bursts, acute stress can actually sharpen your memory, increase your focus, and temporarily boost your immune readiness.
But the problem we're looking at today isn't acute stress. It's chronic stress.
Exactly.
It's what happens when the threat doesn't resolve in 10 minutes. We're talking about enduring an abusive relationship, living with crushing financial insecurity, or working a job where your boss constantly undermines you. In those situations, the cortisol alarm stays blaring for weeks or months or even years.
And this leads us to a crucial concept in our sources, allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
Right. So allostasis is the body's active process of maintaining stability through change. Allostatic load, as defined by researcher Bruce McEwen, is the severe, compounding wear and tear on your internal organs from the repeated, unresolved activation of these emergency systems.
It's like revving a car engine.
Exactly.
Acute stress is like revving the engine for a few seconds to merge onto a busy highway. You need that burst of power, and the car is built to handle it. But chronic stress, this allostatic load, is like driving that car for 100 miles with the emergency brake fully engaged.
Yes.
The friction inevitably destroys the internal machinery. But if this chronic, always-on state is so destructive to our organs, why would human evolution design an emergency system that essentially poisons us if we leave it turned on?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a classic evolutionary mismatch.
Okay.
Human biology evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to deal with short bursts of physical danger predators, rival groups, immediate physical threats in our environment.
Right, tiger in the bushes.
Exactly. Our biology did not evolve for the permanent state of psychological siege created by modern society. A predator doesn't chase you through the woods for 10 minutes and then leave, but a mortgage chases you in your mind for 30 years.
Wow, yeah.
You can't outrun a toxic work environment, but your body is still using a primitive physical response to try and deal with a modern psychological problem. And that chronic activation doesn't just exhaust your immune system and your heart, it physically alters the landscape of your mind.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly pretty unnerving. Our sources detail how chronic stress physically changes the size and shape of different brain regions. How exactly does stress reorganize the brain?
Well, we can see this really clearly in neurobiological studies on rats, again from Bruce McEwen. When researchers subject rats to chronic, unavoidable stress, they observe profound changes in the hippocampus.
And the hippocampus is the brain's center for memory and learning, right?
Yes, memory, learning, and emotional regulation. Under chronic stress, this region actually shrinks.
Shrinks, really.
It shrinks. The neurons retract their dendrites, meaning the physical branches that connect brain cells wither away. They lose the network connections needed to encode new information and think clearly.
So the memory and logic centers are physically degrading.
Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for complex decision-making and impulse control, also loses volume. But the brain isn't just shrinking across the board.
Okay.
At the exact same time, the amygdala, that primitive threat detection hub we discussed earlier, actually grows more dendritic branches. It becomes larger, hyperconnected, and highly reactive.
Wait, the fear center gets bigger.
It does.
It's a literal zero-sum game inside your skull. Under chronic stress, the brain rigs the deck against you. It physically weakens the areas responsible for calm reasoning and complex thought, and it heavily fortifies the areas responsible for fear, aggression, and anxiety.
It feels counterintuitive to us because it makes modern life so much harder, but it makes a perfect evolutionary sense. Well, if your brain's chemical environment suggests you are in a constant, never-ending state of mortal danger, it abandons slow, deep thought. It optimizes purely for hypersensitive threat detection.
Ah, right.
We see the behavioral consequences of this vividly in the animal kingdom.
This brings us to some wild research observing primates in the wild.
Mm-hmm.
I know our sources highlight extensive studies, particularly by Robert Sapolsky, on baboons to understand how social structures drive this kind of chronic brain change.
Yes, this is a landmark area of study. Sapolsky and his team spent decades observing wild baboon troops in the Serengeti.
Right.
They would temporarily dart the animals to draw blood and measure their baseline stress hormones. Because baboons live in highly complex, hierarchical social groups, they are perfect models for human social stress.
What did they find when they compared the baboons at the top of the social ladder to the ones at the bottom?
The differences were staggering. The low-ranking baboons, the ones subjected to chronic social subordination, who were constantly harassed by alphas, who had their grooming interrupted and their food stolen, exhibited persistently elevated cortisol levels.
Wow.
Their resting heart rates were higher, their blood pressure was elevated, and their immune systems were severely suppressed compared to the alpha males.
And what's crazy is that they were living in the exact same physical environment. I mean, They were eating the same diet, drinking the same water, facing the same predators. The key variable driving this massive biological difference was entirely social.
It came down to a chronic lack of control and a lack of predictability. The subordinate baboons had no agency over their daily lives. They never knew when an attack was coming.
Right.
Just existing at the bottom of the hierarchy and having no way to predict or control their environment was enough to wreck their physiology and trigger all that neurological remodeling we just talked about.
But wait, if chronic stress physically shrinks the logic centers of our brains, grows the fear centers, and wrecks our immune systems just from a lack of control, doesn't that contradict the whole modern concept of resilience?
In what way?
Well, if someone is stuck in a toxic, highly stressful job for 5 years, or they're navigating poverty, are they just permanently broken? Does the brain stay rigged for fear forever?
That is a vital concern, but thankfully the answer is no. Because of neuroplasticity, the brain isn't just molded by stress, it can be molded back.
Okay, good.
Resilience isn't a fixed personality trait you are simply born with or without. The brain's circuitry is highly adaptable. When humans are removed from chronic stress, or when they learn new cognitive tools to change their appraisal of threats, the hippocampus can regrow those dendritic branches.
Wow.
The amygdala can shrink back to a normal baseline. Interventions like mindfulness-based stress reduction, developed by John Kabat-Zinn, actively train the prefrontal cortex to exert control over the amygdala, reversing that architectural damage over time.
So as adults, we have the cognitive tools and the neuroplasticity to push back against that remodeling. What happens when that profound lack of control and predictability happens early in life, like during childhood, before the brain is fully formed and before we have any coping mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a much tougher scenario.
Because the sources highlight some massive public health studies showing that early stress casts a very long, dark shadow.
Yes. When you look at the lifelong impacts of stress, we inevitably arrive at the ACE study.
Right.
ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Conducted in 1998 by Felitti and Amanda, researchers tracked tens of thousands of adult patients and found a staggering dose-response relationship between the trauma they experienced as children and the chronic illnesses they developed in their 50s and 60s.
And by dose response, you mean the higher the dose of early stress, the higher the risk later in life.
Exactly.
They categorized adversities like emotional neglect, physical abuse, or having a parent struggling with addiction. And they found that people who experienced 4 or more of these categories had dramatically higher odds of adult depression, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, and substance abuse compared to those with an ACE score of 0.
It's a massive correlation.
But I want to pause here because it's easy to just list statistics. What is the actual mechanism? Like, how does a chaotic household at age 7 translate to a blocked artery at age 50?
It goes right back to the HPA axis and allostatic load. When a developing child's stress response is constantly activated, their baseline cortisol levels remain artificially high.
Okay.
Over decades, that constant wash of stress hormones causes chronic systemic inflammation throughout the body. It damages the lining of the blood vessels, making them more susceptible to plaque buildup, which leads to heart disease.
Wow.
It exhausts the immune system, making it either fail to catch rogue cells or become hyperactive and attack the body itself, leading to autoimmune issues. The trauma becomes biologically embedded.
And it goes even deeper than inflammation. It goes down to the cellular level. Our sources detail a fascinating 2004 study by Evelyn Blackburn looking at the DNA of adults under extreme stress.
Yes, this brings us to the research on telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes that keep our DNA from unraveling.
Like the little plastic tips on the ends of your shoelaces.
Exactly like that. Every time a cell divides, those telomeres get a tiny bit shorter. When they get too short, the cell stops dividing and eventually dies. It is a fundamental cellular marker for biological aging.
Right.
Researchers studied a group of mothers who were full-time caregivers for chronically ill children, so a population under intense, relentless psychological stress. They found that the more years a mother had spent as a caregiver and the more subjectively stressed she felt, the shorter her telomeres were compared to mothers of healthy children.
So the psychological stress was literally accelerating the aging process of their DNA.
Yes, on a cellular level.
The stakes here are immense. We are saying that stress isn't just an abstract feeling. It is a biological fingerprint that dictates how fast your cells degrade. But if childhood trauma and chronic stress bake this into our very DNA caps, are people with high ACE scores or stressful lives just doomed by their past?
This raises an important question about biological determinism. While the biological trace is absolutely real, it is not a life sentence. Environment, strong social support networks, and effective coping mechanisms still play a massive protective role in our health outcomes.
Okay, that's a relief.
The biological mark is a risk factor, not an absolute destiny. The human body has incredible repair mechanisms, including an enzyme called telomerase, that can actually rebuild and lengthen those protective caps when the stress is mitigated.
Understanding that stress is malleable leads us directly into some of the biggest debates and misconceptions we need to clear up today. Because public perception of stress is riddled with inaccuracies.
Oh, definitely.
First off, stress is not the same thing as anxiety, is it?
No, they are frequently conflated, but they are distinct. Stress is a physiological response to an identifiable external demand, a looming deadline, an argument, a physical threat. When the demand is removed, the stress response usually subsides.
Right, but anxiety is different.
Right. Anxiety is characterized by persistent, excessive worry that lacks a clear, proportionate external trigger. The alarm system fires even when there is no tiger. However, enduring chronic stress is one of the biggest risk factors for eventually developing an anxiety disorder because, as we discussed, it physically biases the brain's architecture toward threat detection.
Another major misconception is the blanket statement that all stress is inherently bad. As we mentioned earlier, acute stress is actually vital for survival. The sources highlight Firdaus Dabhar's research showing that a brief acute stressor actually temporarily boosts your immune system by deploying immune cells to the skin and tissues where an injury is most likely to occur.
It's an evolutionary defense mechanism.
Exactly. But perhaps the most famous myth of all, one that has dominated corporate culture for decades, is the type A personality.
Ah, the type A myth. This one is huge. In 1959, cardiologists Friedman and Rosenman proposed that being a highly competitive, impatient, time-urgent person was a direct predictor of heart attacks.
And it became a massive cultural phenomenon. It reshaped how corporations handled wellness.
Everyone wanted to know if they were a type A or a type B.
But when large-scale, rigorous scientific replications were done later on, the broad type A construct totally fell apart, didn't it?
Completely. Simply being competitive, talking fast, or wanting to get things done quickly did not predict heart disease at all.
Really?
When researchers picked the data apart, they found that only two very narrow components of the type A profile actually held up as dangerous to heart health: hostility and cynicism.
Which is a massive distinction. Being driven and ambitious doesn't kill you. Walking around with chronic hostility and expecting the worst of everyone around you is what keeps that HPA axis chronically inflamed.
Exactly. And, there's also the Yerkes-Dodson law, that inverted U curve showing that a certain amount of stress actually peaks our performance before it drops off. Stress isn't universally bad.
Right. And occupational health researchers have heavily criticized how corporations weaponize this type A myth. Organizations would use the type A idea to blame employees for not coping better or not being resilient enough, rather than fixing the structural issues that were causing the stress in the first place.
Like understaffing, lack of autonomy, or impossible deadlines.
Exactly. Which brings us to the most crucial paradigm shift in the entire deep dive. If we go back to Richard Lazarus and his transactional model, the idea that stress is ultimately governed by our cognitive appraisal of an event, researchers have recently taken this concept to its absolute limit.
Yes, this is the Mindset Study by Kelly McGonigal and Elia Crum, and it completely upends everything we think we know about stress and mortality.
It really does. Break this one down for us.
Yeah. So, researchers analyzed data from roughly 30,000 adults in the United States over 8 years. They asked them two questions. How much stress have you experienced in the last year? And do you believe that stress is harmful to your health?
Okay.
Then they used public death records to see who passed away.
Okay, and what did the data show?
The data showed that experiencing high amounts of stress did indeed predict a significantly higher risk of mortality. But, and this is the massive caveat, only among the people who also believed that stress was fundamentally harmful to their health.
Let me stop you there because this is mind-blowing. People who reported experiencing high levels of stress, but who did not view that stress as harmful, they had no increased mortality risk at all.
None. In fact, they had some of the lowest risk profiles of anyone in the entire study, even lower than people who experienced very little stress.
So what does this all mean? Are you saying that simply changing my opinion about this deep dive right now could theoretically lower my mortality risk?
Yeah.
Is mindset actually a biological shield? Because that sounds a bit like magic.
It sounds like magic, but it is pure, quantifiable biology. Remember, cognitive appraisal is the on switch for the HPA axis.
Right.
When you believe stress is harmful, your brain categorizes the physiological arousal, your racing heart, your fast breathing as a mortal threat. It pumps out a massive, sustained cortisol response, and your blood vessels physically constrict.
Okay.
But if you view that exact same physical arousal as your body successfully mobilizing energy to meet a challenge, the brain alters the chemical cascade. It releases different ratios of hormones, like DHEA, which helps the brain grow stronger from the experience.
Wow.
And crucially, during a challenge response, your blood vessels stay relaxed, similar to what happens when you experience joy or courage. Mindset is a measurable physiological variable. How you appraise the stress dictates the physical reality of the stress in your bloodstream.
That is profound. And bringing it all together for you listening, understanding this isn't just neat academic trivia. This dictates how our entire society needs to function. Think about the mental health fallout from a global crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, a mass event of chronic, unpredictable stress that perfectly mirrors those wild primate studies where a lack of control damages the immune system.
Absolutely.
Or look at workplace burnout, often described as Maslach syndrome, which is characterized by emotional exhaustion and cynicism tied to occupational stress.
Huh.
We can't fix these massive societal issues by just telling people to download a meditation app. We have to address the chronic allostatic load of modern environments.
And it's why public health policy is slowly shifting. Knowing what we know now about the ACE study, doctors are increasingly screening for childhood adversity as a preventive measure, recognizing that those early experiences physically shape the biology of the adult. But the most empowering takeaway is on the individual level. You cannot always control the stressors in your life, the traffic jams, or the difficult bosses. But how you interpret your body's response to those stressors matters just as much as the stressor itself.
Which leaves us with one final, wild thought to chew on. Our sources briefly touched on the field of epigenetics, specifically looking at maternal behavior in animals.
Yes, Michael Meany's research.
Right. Researchers found that when mother rats engaged in highly nurturing behavior, like frequently licking and grooming their pups, that environment actually permanently altered the gene expression for the pup's stress hormones. The nurturing behavior changed how the genes were switched on and off, without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself.
It's a beautiful counterbalance to the damage of chronic stress. Nurture and care leave a biological fingerprint, too.
And it makes you wonder, if chronic stress can alter how our genes are expressed, and we now know that our mindset can neutralize the physical damage of stress down to the level of our blood vessels. Could teaching the next generation to actively reappraise their stress, to view their racing hearts as a tool rather than a threat, actually alter human gene expression on a species-wide scale?
That is a fascinating thought.
Could we literally think and nurture our way into a more resilient genome? It's something to ponder the next time you feel that heavy sensation in your chest before a big meeting. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.